If Dark Side of the Moon were merely a great rock record, no one would still be arguing about it 53 years later. Great rock records exist in abundance. Exile on Main Saint, Who's Next, Physical Graffiti, Marquee Moon. The trouble with asking why Dark Side is the most important is not that the question is hard to answer. It is that the question is imprecisely framed. The album's importance does not lie in some superlative of greatness that separates it from its contemporaries by degree. It lies in a difference of category. What Pink Floyd delivered in February of 1973 was not simply better rock. It was the demonstration, for the first time technically sustainable across every dimension the phrase implies, that rock could function as a musical form capable of sustaining the same kind of architectural coherence that the Western classical tradition demands of a symphony or a solo cello suite, not as aspiration, as accomplished fact. And yet most analyses in circulation treat the record as a collection of memorable tracks with sophisticated production. What they miss is precisely what makes it singular. Dark Side of the Moon is not an album with a good track sequence. It is a cyclic form, a compositional structure in which the material at the end returns to the material at the beginning, not out of dramatic convenience, but because the work's internal logic demands that circularity to complete its argument. The heartbeats that open Speak to Me and close Eclipse are not an aesthetic packaging device. They are the most precise articulation of the album's philosophical thesis. Human consciousness is a closed loop between birth and death, and everything in between, ambition, money, madness, time, war, is variation on the same unresolvable theme. That is cyclic form in the technically rigorous sense, analogous to the structure César Franck and Vincent d'Indy developed within the French school tradition of the late 19th century, where the opening thematic material returns transformed at the close precisely to reveal that the transformation did not cancel the origin. Roger Waters, who has rarely received credit as a theorist of musical form, with most commentary preferring to dwell on his ideological acidity or his band conflicts, constructed here a compositional arc that very few rock albums have even attempted. What is more unsettling, he did it without appearing to try. Examine Breathe with the attention it deserves. The progression sustaining the verses, a movement from E minor 7th to A minor 7th, then to D minor 7th resolving to G major, operates within a tonal field that permanently flirts with the Dorian mode, without ever fully committing to it. Richard Wright voices this harmony, with a touch that owes more to Miles Davis's modal jazz on Kind of Blue than to any contemporary British rock reference, and the concrete effect on the listener is suspension. The tonality never lands. Resolution is perpetually deferred, and that suspension is not anxiety. It is structural melancholy, the feeling of something that has always been happening and will continue happening after you stop listening. Wright was, technically, the most harmonically sophisticated musician in Pink Floyd, and his contribution to this album is systematically underestimated in favor of the simpler narrative of Waters as architect and Gilmour as voice. The simpler narrative is, as usual, the less accurate one. On the Run is where most listeners, even today, hear only texture. That is a mistake. What Nick Dobson, the Abbey Road recording engineer frequently forgotten in the album's production history, and Alan Parsons built here, is a study in stereophonic spatialization as autonomous compositional instrument. The arpeggio sequence generated by the EMS Synthi A is not simply an electronic loop. It occupies the stereo field rotationally, traversing from left to right and back with a periodicity that does not correspond to the pulse of the sequence itself, creating a polyrhythm between the sonic event and its position in space, two layers shifting independently. Through quality headphones, this produces a spatial disorientation that is no production accident. It is the sonic experience of what the album's later lyrics describe as the relentless running that never arrives anywhere. Parsons, who was 23 during the recording sessions and had come from an assistant role on the Beatles' Abbey Road sessions, constructed here a production landscape that anticipates practices electronic music would take decades to systematize. The quadraphonic format used in the live presentations of the material, Pink Floyd toured what would become Dark Side for nearly a year before recording it in the studio, informed spatialization decisions that the stereo mix preserved in compressed but intact form. The result is an album that demands headphones not because volume is relevant, but because half the compositional information resides in the spatial dimension. Time forces a distinction that rock criticism rarely has vocabulary to make. The introduction, that accumulation of clocks, bells, and alarm sounds preceding the band's entry, is not atmospheric interlude. It functions as the compositional slow introduction in the classical sense, establishing thematic material in unrecognizable form before the main exposition reveals it in its canonical shape. Nick Mason's drum riff that inaugurates the principal section is built on a displaced groove, in which the kick drum falls on the third beat of a 4/4 bar rather than the first, producing a rhythmic accentuation that the ear repeatedly attempts to reinterpolate onto the conventional downbeat and fails, generating a sensation of perpetually delayed arrival. It is not a coincidence that the song is about the perception of time slipping away. And then Gilmour. The guitar solo on Time is cited often as one of the greatest in rock history, which is true, but for the wrong reasons. It is not the speed, the range, or the technical exuberance. It is the restraint. Gilmour operates in a minor pentatonic with blue note inflections at the 12th fret, and what is remarkable is not what he plays, but where he breathes. The silences within the solo, the pauses preceding phrases, the decision not to ornament where a less self-assured guitarist would insert a flourish, function as syntactic punctuation. A Schenkerian analysis of the solo would reveal a long-range structure in which the arrival note of each phrase serves as the departure note of the next, creating a continuous line unfolding across 4 minutes without repeating a single gesture. That is thematic development in the Beethovenian sense, executed on an electric guitar through a high-watt DR-103 with univibe sustain. The Great Gig in the Sky deserves separate analysis for what Claire Torrey does there, one of the most misunderstood vocal performances in rock history. What most people describe as emotional improvisation was constructed by Torrey across 2 or 3 takes, with minimal direction from Wright, something to the effect of the piece being about death, about dying, and the result is a wordless vocal that functions harmonically as a concert cadenza. She ornaments and expands the harmonic field Wright established in the chord voicings, exploring chromaticisms and intervallic leaps of sixths and sevenths that transform the voice into a melodic instrument without lexical anchor. No lyrics, no words, and it is the most emotionally direct track on the album. That is a technical statement about where meaning resides in music, not in semantics, but in sonic syntax. Money is where most critics stop, announce 7/4 time, and consider the work done. 7/4, yes, but the intelligence of the choice lies in how the unusual meter is completely naturalized by Waters's bass riff, which divides the 7 beats into 2 groups of 3 and 1 group of 1, or 3-2-2, depending on how the ear chooses to reinterpolate the phrase. What the listener experiences is not metric discomfort, it is a groove, which is precisely the technical paradox Waters solved, constructing an odd meter that sounds inevitable. Dick Parry's saxophone solo, which most commentary treats as timbral color, a blues moment inserted for textural variety, is harmonically subversive. Parry plays over a field that modulates to C major during the solo, departing from the original key of E minor and returning through a Dorian in a way that makes the final resolution sound like a homecoming from a digression the ear barely registered making. That is sophisticated harmonic development, embedded in a context that superficially presents itself as rock with an irregular time signature, us and them, which Waters and Wright had originally composed for Michelangelo Antonioni's Zabriskie Point soundtrack, and which Antonioni rejected as too gentle, carries in its harmonies the reason the filmmaker made the wrong choice. Wright's progression is fundamentally an alternation of D major to G major, with chromatic bass-passing tones that produce a sensation of tonal sliding, and Gilmour's voice executes it in 2 registers, building a third interval vocal harmony that doubles the chord structure in human voices. The effect is of a piece of music that knows it is about failure, but refuses to convert that knowledge into bitterness. It is the only track on the album that resolves harmonically with full completion, and its placement, as the penultimate major statement before Brain Damage and Eclipse, is a decision of formal architecture. It is the only piece the album permits. Brain Damage and Eclipse exist as a single movement, and here the cyclic form completes its argument. The progression in Brain Damage, D major descending chromatically to C sharp, then C, then B, a semitonal bass descent that pitch class set theory would describe as a contraction of the tonal field toward unison, resolves in Eclipse into a D major to G major sequence that is the same foundational progression of breathe. The circularity is not metaphor. It is literally the same harmonic material returning. And when the heartbeats reappear in the final fade after the silence following eclipse, the form is closed. The argument has concluded without a single word of conclusion. The technical genealogy of what Dark Side introduced, and where it came from, demands honesty in both directions. Backward. The integration of electronics, musique concrète, and spoken voice as legitimate compositional material comes directly from Karlheinz Stockhausen and Pierre Schaeffer. Pink Floyd, particularly through Syd Barrett in the early recordings, had absorbed European avant-garde in ways that most British rock bands of the period completely ignored. Wright's harmonic language drew on the modal jazz of Bill Evans and McCoy Tyner, before filtering that influence through Ray Charles's melodic melancholy, two worlds that rarely intersected in England in 1972. The Wright, Parsons' production decisions and the cyclic formal integration that Dark Side exemplifies directly informed what Peter Gabriel would do in the post-Genesis period, what Brian Eno would develop as ambient not as relaxation, but as architecture, and, at greater remove, what Radiohead absorbed in the late 1990s when they decided they no longer wanted to make rock in the conventional sense of the term. What Dark Side did not accomplish, and precision requires saying this, is resolve the central problem of progressive rock, the relationship between technical complexity and expressive necessity. The album is extraordinary precisely because it never sounds exhibitionist, but that virtue is uncommon in the genre it inhabited. Most prog albums of 1973 are complexity serving the ego, and the veteran listener who has spent decades with the genre can recognize that distinction immediately. Tales from Topographic Oceans, released by Yes 6 months later, is the perfect counterpoint. Equally ambitious in formal scale, radically inferior in expressive necessity, a cathedral built without a congregation. Dark Side is not a cathedral. It is a room where the acoustics were calculated so that every word resonates in precisely the right way. Production contrasts with composition in ways that criticism constantly conflates. Alan Parsons did not compose Dark Side, but the vocal capture decisions, the choice to record Abbey Road staff speaking about money and madness onto tape, and integrate those recordings as melodic material within the tracks, are production decisions with compositional consequences. Parsons understood that on an album about the human condition, the unprocessed human voice was the most honest instrument available. The spoken fragments from Paul McCartney, Henry McCullough, and Jerry Driscoll about money, anger, and sanity are not testimonials inserted for documentary value. They are motifs. And when money opens with the sound of cash registers and coins before the bass riff enters, Parsons and Waters are applying the same principle Stockhausen applied in Gesang der Jünglinge, the concrete sound of the world functioning as a musical pitch. Nick Mason deserves a defense he rarely receives. Conventional criticism treats him as the technically weakest drummer in high-prestige prog rock, the band's soft link. What this reading misses is the confusion between simplicity and adequacy. What the album's formal architecture demanded was not the percussive virtuosity of Bill Bruford or Carl Palmer. It demanded a drummer capable of sustaining groove without imposing himself, of creating space without filling space. Mason does exactly this with the precision of someone who understands that the rhythmic function of the great gig in the sky is different from the rhythmic function of money, and that responding to that difference with the same vocabulary would be incompetence, not versatility. He is not limited. He is specific. The best-selling album in history after Michael Jackson's Thriller, a position it maintained for decades, never leaving the British Top 100 since 1973, did not reach that place through marketing accident or generational nostalgia. It arrived there because the musical form functions as an argument that does not depend on cultural context to be understood. You can listen to Dark Side of the Moon knowing nothing about Pink Floyd, nothing about prog rock, nothing about Abbey Road, nothing about 1973, and the album's emotional progression still operates on you with the precision of a geometric proof, not because the album is accessible in the sense of being simplified, but because the formal architecture is sufficiently rigorous that experiencing it requires no explicit intellectual mediation. The recording industry in 1973 was not prepared for a rock album with this level of formal ambition, and the industry's instinct, predictably, was to describe it in terms it already understood: psychedelic, atmospheric, experimental. Those descriptors are not wrong. They are inadequate. They describe the surface texture of a work whose real achievement is structural. Calling Darkside atmospheric is like calling the Goldberg Variations pleasant harpsichord music. Technically accurate, completely beside the point. What Parsons achieved in the control room and what Waters conceived on paper are not the same achievement, and conflating them produces the wrong understanding of both. Waters built the argument. Parsons built the room in which the argument could be heard completely. Gilmour translated the argument into tone. His guitar on the record is not decoration. It is the emotional register that converts Waters's philosophical propositions into felt experience. Wright provided the harmonic grammar without which none of the argument would cohere. Mason held the temporal architecture in place without ever letting it collapse into mere timekeeping. These are 5 distinct compositional and performative contributions that the standard narrative of Waters and Gilmour constantly obscures, and the obscuring is a loss for anyone who wants to understand how this particular piece of music actually works. The heartbeat does not ask to be understood. It simply continues, before the first note, after the last silence, in the register where music lives when it has finished being music, and becomes something that the body already knew.